I am so happy this week that we get to return to my absolute most favorite topic as a priest. We get to talk about the Eucharist this week. And specifically, we have a few questions all related around proper behavior, proper posture during Mass, and in a particular way during the distribution, consumption of the Eucharist, which, by the way, I want to emphasize again. Eucharist is the name of that rite within the celebration of the Mass. It is inclusive both of the body and blood of Jesus. So I want to say one more time, we are receiving the Eucharist, we are receiving communion when we receive the body of Jesus, when we receive the blood of Jesus, or when we receive both. Additionally, if we do receive both, it is not as though we are receiving additional grace. Either species alone contains the totality of the grace conveyed by the sacrament. But this week we have some more specific questions. The first question was, if during the distribution of communion, I choose not to receive the precious blood of Jesus, is there any gesture or action that is required when I pass the precious blood of Jesus in the church? And so I'll begin by saying the overall guideline is that whatever we choose to do or not do at Mass, it always ought to be for the purpose of increasing our reverence and our worshipfulness that is appropriate to that part of the Mass. So, in regard to the first question, um, if you can make some gesture, maybe kneel, maybe bow, maybe make the sign of the cross, if you can do so without depriving another person of, again, of the desire to maintain proper reverence and proper worshipfulness in that moment during the Mass, then absolutely do it. But typically, especially on Sundays when things start to get a little crowded, to even stop to make the sign of the cross may be disruptive or cause traffic problems during the distribution of communion. So I would just say in that particular case, be mindful of what's going on around you. And again, be careful to maintain that reverence and worshipfulness, not only for yourself, but for your brothers and sisters who are present as well. The second question was, well, when I return to my seat, what's the appropriate time to sit back down? And again, I would say it depends on who you are. Um, for a person who is attending Mass, a lay person attending Mass, I would make the following recommendation: that after you receive communion, make an appropriate prayer after communion. And there are some vocal prayers, there are formal prayers after receiving communion. You could make one of those. In my own life, I usually say something simple like, Lord, I am so grateful for everything that you just did for me. But I would say that whatever devotion, whatever expression of gratitude is suitable for you and most meaningful for you, most worshipful and reverent for you, go ahead and sit back down. And there's not a particular point in the Mass outside of that that says, this is when you ought to be standing or walking or kneeling, and this is when you can return to sitting. Third question is a pretty common one. And again, what is the proper posture during the Our Father? And again, the overall principle is to maintain the proper reverence, the proper worshipfulness during that part of the Mass. And in all of the parishes that I've ever been to, there have been a whole variety of customs and a whole variety of practices, some of which have been very consistent with the desire to maintain reverence and worshipfulness, some of which have been very clearly disruptive to those things. I remember one time I was out of town on business on a day of obligation. I went to some parish that I'd never been to before. And when we got to the Our Father, another parishioner actually reached over the aisle and grabbed my hand. And my first thought was, well, she must think I'm somebody else. So immediately I took my hand back. And she reached over the aisle and grabbed my hand again. And again, and it's very clearly disruptive to the reverence and worshipfulness that is proper to that time of the Mass. So again, but at the same time, I'm not going to come running down from the altar if I see anyone doing something that I think is inappropriate. So I would ask everyone um, to exercise their own judgment, particularly in regard, if you are raising your hands, be sure that you're doing so with a proper motive. If you're holding hands with a family member, your spouse, or your children, again, I'm not the one to judge what constitutes reverence and worshipfulness for you, but I would ask you to carefully reconsider anything that you might be doing that could even potentially be a distraction or disruption for someone else, and then respond accordingly. So, in summary, remember that God is who He says He is. Remember that you are who He says you are, and live the life that He created you to live.